The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. Chapter 5. It was cloudy in Italy, which surprised them. They had expected brilliant sunshine. But never mind. It was Italy, and the very clouds looked fat. Neither of them had ever been there before. Both gazed out of the windows with rapt faces. The hours flew as long as it was daylight, and after that there was the excitement of getting nearer, getting quite near, getting there. At Genoa it had begun to rain. Genoa. Imagine actually being at Genoa, seeing its name written up in the station just like any other name. At Nervi it was pouring, and when at last, towards midnight, for again the train was late, they got to Mezzago, the rain was coming down in what seemed solid sheets. But it was Italy. Nothing it did could be bad. The very rain was different. Straight rain, falling properly onto one's umbrella, not that violently blowing English stuff that got in everywhere. And it did leave off, and when it did, behold, the earth would be strewn with roses. Mr. Briggs, San Salvatore's owner, had said, "You get out at Mezzago, and then you drive." But he had forgotten what he amply knew, that trains in Italy are sometimes late, and he had imagined his tenants arriving at Mezzago at 8 o'clock and finding a string of flies to choose from. The train was 4 hours late, and when Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins scrambled down the ladder-like high steps of their carriage into the black downpour, their skirts sweeping off great pools of sooty wet because their hands were full of suitcases, if it had not been for the vigilance of Domenico, the gardener at San Salvatore, they would have found nothing for them to drive in. All ordinary flies had long since gone home. Domenico, foreseeing this, had sent his aunt's fly, driven by her son, his cousin. And his aunt and her fly lived in Castagneto, the village crouching at the feet of San Salvatore. And therefore, however late the train was, the fly would not dare come home without containing that which it had been sent to fetch. Domenico's cousin's name was Beppo, and he presently emerged out of the dark where Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins stood, uncertain what to do next after the train had gone on, for they could see no porter, and they thought, from the feel of it, that they were standing not so much on a platform as in the middle of the permanent way. Beppo, who had been searching for them, emerged from the dark with a kind of pounce and talked Italian to them vociferously. Beppo was a most respectable young man, but he did not look as if he were, especially not in the dark, and he had a dripping hat slouched over one eye. They did not like the way he seized their suitcases. He could not be, they thought, a porter. However, they presently, from out of his streaming talk, discerned the words San Salvatore, and after that they kept on saying them to him, for it was the only Italian they knew, as they hurried after him, unwilling to lose sight of their suitcases, stumbling across rails and through puddles, out to where in the road a small high fly stood. Its hood was up, and its horse was in an attitude of thought. They climbed in, and the minute they were in, Mrs. Wilkins, indeed, could hardly be called in, the horse awoke with a start from its reverie and immediately began going home rapidly, without Beppo, without the suitcases. Beppo darted after him, making the night ring with his shouts, and caught the hanging reins just in time. He explained proudly, and, as it seemed to him, with perfect clearness, that the horse always did that, being a fine animal, full of corn and blood, and cared for by him, Beppo, as if he were his own son. And the ladies must be alarmed. He had noticed they were clutching each other. But clear and loud and profuse of words though he was, they only looked at him blankly. He went on talking, however, while he piled the suitcases up round them, sure that sooner or later they must understand him, especially as he was careful to talk very loud and illustrate everything he said with the simplest elucidatory gestures. But they both continued only to look at him. They both, he noticed sympathetically, had white faces, fatigued faces, and they both had big eyes, fatigued eyes. They were beautiful ladies, he thought, and their eyes, looking at him over the tops of the suitcases, watching his every movement — there were no trunks, only numbers of suitcases — were like the eyes of the Mother of God. The only thing the ladies said, and they repeated it at regular intervals even after they had started, gently prodding him as he sat on his box to call his attention to it, was, "San Salvatore?" And each time he answered vociferously, encouragingly, "Si, si, San Salvatore." "We don't know, of course, if he's taking us there," said Mrs. Arbuthnot at last in a low voice, after they'd been driving, it seemed to them, a long while, and had got off the paving stones of the sleep-shrouded town and were out on a winding road with what they could just see was a low wall on their left, beyond which was a great black emptiness and the sound of the sea. On their right was something close and steep and high and black. Rocks, they whispered to each other, huge rocks. They felt very uncomfortable. It was so late. It was so dark. The road was so lonely. Suppose the wheel came off? Suppose they met fascisti, or the opposite of fascisti? How sorry they were now that they had not slept at Genoa and come on the next morning in daylight. "But that would have been the 1st of April, said Mrs. Wilkins in a low voice. "It is that now," said Mrs. Arbuthnot beneath her breath. "So it is," murmured Mrs. Wilkins. They were silent. Beppo turned round on his box, a disquieting habit already noticed, for surely his horse ought to be carefully watched, and again addressed them with what he was convinced was lucidity, no patois, and the clearest explanatory movements. How much they wished their mothers had made them learn Italian when they were little. If only now they could have said, "Please sit round the right way and look after the horse." They did not even know what horse was in Italian. It was contemptible to be so ignorant. In their anxiety, for the road twisted round great jutting rocks, and on their left was only the low wall to keep them out of the sea should anything happen, they too began to gesticulate, waving their hands at Beppo, pointing ahead. They wanted him to turn round again and face his horse, that was all. He thought they wanted him to drive faster, and there followed a terrifying 10 minutes, during which, as he supposed, he was gratifying them. He was proud of his horse, and it could go very fast. He rose in his seat, the whip cracked, the horse rushed forward, the rocks leaped towards them, the little fly swayed, the suitcases heaved, Mrs. Arbuthnot and Mrs. Wilkins clung. In this way they continued, swaying, heaving, clattering, clinging, till at a point near Castagneto there was a rise in the road, and on reaching the foot of the rise the horse, who knew every inch of the way, stopped suddenly, throwing everything in the fly into a heap, and then proceeded up at the slowest of walks. Beppo twisted himself round to receive their admiration, laughing with pride in his horse. There was no answering laugh from the beautiful ladies. Their eyes, fixed on him, seemed bigger than ever, and their faces against the black of the night showed milky. But here at least, once they were up the slope, were houses. The rocks left off, and there were houses. The low wall left off, and there were houses. The sea shrunk away, and the sound of it ceased, and the loneliness of the road was finished. No lights anywhere, of course, nobody to see them pass. And yet Beppo, when the houses began, after looking over his shoulder and shouting "Castagneto" at the ladies, once more stood up and cracked his whip, and once more made his horse dash forward. "We shall be there in a minute," Mrs. Arbuthnot said to herself, holding on. "We shall soon stop now," Mrs. Wilkins said to herself, holding on. They said nothing aloud, because nothing could have been heard above the whip-cracking and wheel-clattering and the boisterous, inciting noises Beppo was making at his horse. Anxiously they strained their eyes for any sight of the beginning of San Salvatore. They had supposed and hoped that after a reasonable amount of village a medieval archway would loom upon them, and through it they would drive into a garden and draw up at an open, welcoming door with light streaming from it, and those servants standing in it who, according to the advertisement, remained. Instead, the fly suddenly stopped. Peering out, they could see they were still in the village street, with small dark houses each side, and Beppo, throwing the reins over the horse's back, as if completely confident this time that he would not go any farther, got down off his box. At the same moment, springing as it seemed out of nothing, a man and several half-grown boys appeared on each side of the fly and began dragging out the suitcases. "No, no! San Salvatore! San Salvatore!" exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins, trying to hold on to what suitcases she could. "Si, si! San Salvatore!" they all shouted, pulling. "This can't be San Salvatore," said Mrs. Wilkins, turning to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who sat quite still, watching her suitcases being taken from her with the same patience she applied to lesser evils. She knew she could do nothing if these men were wicked men determined to have her suitcases. "I don't think it can be," she admitted, and could not refrain from a moment's wonder at the ways of God. Had she really been brought here, she and poor Mrs. Wilkins, after so much trouble in arranging it, so much difficulty and worry, along such devious paths of prevarication and deceit, only to be— She checked her thoughts and gently said to Mrs. Wilkins, while the ragged youths disappeared with the suitcases into the night, and the man with the lantern helped Beppo pull the rug off her, that they were both in God's hands, and for the first time on hearing this, Mrs. Wilkins was afraid. There was nothing for it but to get out. Useless to try to go on sitting in the fly repeating San Salvatore. Every time they said it, and their voices each time were fainter. Beppo and the other man merely echoed it in a series of loud shouts. If only they had learned Italian when they were little. If only they could have said, "We wish to be driven to the door." But they did not even know what door was in Italian. Such ignorance was not only contemptible, it was, they now saw, definitely dangerous. Useless, however, to lament it now. Useless to put off whatever it was that was going to happen to them by trying to go on sitting in the fly. They therefore got out. The two men opened their umbrellas for them and handed them to them. From this they received a faint encouragement, because they could not believe that if these men were wicked, they would pause to open umbrellas. The man with the lantern then made signs to them to follow him, talking loud and quickly, and Beppo, they noticed, remained behind. Ought they to pay him? Not, they thought, if they were going to be robbed and perhaps murdered. Surely on such an occasion one did not pay. Besides, he had not, after all, brought them to San Salvatore. Where they had got to was evidently somewhere else. Also, he did not show the least wish to be paid. He let them go away into the night with no clamour at all. This, they could not help thinking, was a bad sign. He asked for nothing, because presently he was to get so much. They came to some steps. The road ended abruptly in a church and some descending steps. The man held the lantern low for them to see the steps. "San Salvatore?" said Mrs. Wilkins once again, very faintly, before committing herself to the steps. It was useless to mention it now, of course, but she could not go down steps in complete silence. No medieval castle, she was sure, was ever built at the bottom of steps. Again, however, came the echoing shout, "Si, si, San Salvatore." They descended gingerly, holding up their skirts, just as if they would be wanting them another time, and had not, in all probability, finished with skirts forever. The steps ended in a steeply sloping path with flat stone slabs down the middle. They slipped a good deal on these wet slabs, and the man with the lantern, talking loud and quickly, held them up. His way of holding them up was polite. "Perhaps," said Mrs. Wilkins in a low voice to Mrs. Arbuthnot, "it is all right after all." "We're in God's hands," said Mrs. Arbuthnot again, and again Mrs. Wilkins was afraid. They reached the bottom of the sloping path, and the light of the lantern flickered over an open space with houses round three sides. The sea was the fourth side, lazily washing backwards and forwards on pebbles. "San Salvatore," said the man, pointing with his lantern to a black mass curved round the water like an arm flung about it. They strained their eyes. They saw the black mass, and on the top of it a light. "San Salvatore?" they both repeated incredulously, for where were the suitcases, and why had they been forced to get out of the fly? "Si, si, San Salvatore." They went along what seemed to be a quay, right on the edge of the water. There was not even a low wall here. Nothing to prevent the man with the lantern tipping them in if he wanted to. He did not, however, tip them in. Perhaps it was all right after all, Mrs. Wilkins again suggested to Mrs. Arbuthnot on noticing this, who this time was herself beginning to think that it might be, and said no more about God's hands. The flicker of the lantern danced along, reflected in the wet pavement of the quay. Out to the left, in the darkness, and evidently at the end of a jetty, was a red light. They came to an archway with a heavy iron gate. The man with the lantern pushed the gate open. This time they went up steps instead of down, and at the top of them was a little path that wound upwards among flowers. They could not see the flowers, but the whole place was evidently full of them. It here dawned on Mrs. Wilkins that perhaps the reason why the fly had not driven them up to the door was that there was no road, only a footpath. That also would explain the disappearance of the suitcases. She began to feel confident that they would find their suitcases waiting for them when they got to the top. San Salvatore was, it seemed, on the top of a hill, as a medieval castle should be. At a turn of the path they saw above them, much nearer now and shining more brightly, the light they had seen from the quay. She told Mrs. Arbuthnot of her dawning belief, and Mrs. Arbuthnot agreed that it was very likely a true one. Once more, but this time in a tone of real hopefulness, Mrs. Wilkins said, pointing upwards at the black outline against the only slightly less black sky. San Salvatore? And once more, but this time comfortingly, encouragingly, came back the assurance, Si, si, San Salvatore. They crossed a little bridge over what was apparently a ravine, and then came a flat bit with long grass at the sides and more flowers. They felt the grass flicking wet against their stockings, and the invisible flowers were everywhere. Then up again through trees, along a zigzag path, with the smell all the way of the flowers they could not see. The warm rain was bringing out all the sweetness. Higher and higher they went in this sweet darkness, and the red light on the jetty dropped farther and farther below them. The path wound round to the other side of what appeared to be a little peninsula. The jetty and the red light disappeared. Across the emptiness on their left were distant lights. Mezzago, said the man, waving his lantern at the lights. Si, si, they answered, for they had by now learned si, si, upon which the man congratulated them in a great flow of polite words, not one of which they understood, on their magnificent Italian. For this was Domenico, the vigilant and accomplished gardener of San Salvatore, the prop and stay of the establishment, the resourceful, the gifted, the eloquent, the courteous, the intelligent Domenico. Only they did not know that yet, and he did in the dark, and even sometimes in the light, look with his knife-sharp, swarthy features and swift panther movements, very like somebody wicked. They passed along another flat bit of path with a black shape like a high wall towering above them on their right, and then the path went up again under trellises, and trailing sprays of scented things caught at them and shook raindrops on them, and the light of the lantern flickered over lilies. And then came a flight of ancient steps worn with centuries, and then another iron gate, and then they were inside, though still climbing a twisting flight of stone steps with old walls on either side, like the walls of dungeons, and with a vaulted roof. At the top was a wrought iron door, and through it shone a flood of electric light. Ecco, said Domenico, lithely running up the last few steps ahead and pushing the door open. And there they were, arrived. And it was San Salvatore. And their suitcases were waiting for them. And they had not been murdered. They looked at each other's white faces and blinking eyes very solemnly. It was a great, a wonderful moment. Here they were, in their medieval castle at last. Their feet touched its stones. Mrs. Wilkins put her arm around Mrs. Arbuthnot's neck and kissed her. The first thing to happen in this house, she said softly, solemnly, shall be a kiss. Dear Lottie, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Dear Rose, said Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes brimming with gladness. Domenico was delighted. He liked to see beautiful ladies kiss. He made them a most appreciative speech of welcome, and they stood arm in arm, holding each other up, for they were very tired, blinking smilingly at him, and not understanding a word. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6. When Mrs. Wilkins woke next morning, she lay in bed a few minutes before getting up and opening the shutters. What would she see out of her window? A shining world, or a world of rain? But it would be beautiful. Whatever it was would be beautiful. She was in a little bedroom with bare white walls and a stone floor and sparse old furniture. The beds, there were 2, were made of iron, enamelled black and painted with bunches of gay flowers. She lay putting off the great moment of going to the window, as one puts off opening a precious letter, gloating over it. She had no idea what time it was. She'd forgotten to wind up her watch ever since, centuries ago, she last went to bed in Hampstead. No sounds were to be heard in the house, so she supposed it was very early. Yet she felt as if she had slept a long while, so completely rested, so perfectly content. She lay with her arms clasped round her head, thinking how happy she was. Her lips curved upwards in a delighted smile. In bed by herself. Adorable condition. She had not been in a bed without Mellersh once now for 5 whole years. And the cool roominess of it, the freedom of one's movements, the sense of recklessness, of audacity, in giving the blankets a pull if one wanted to, or twitching the pillows more comfortably. It was like the discovery of an entirely new joy. Mrs. Wilkins longed to get up and open the shutters, but where she was really so very delicious. She gave a sigh of contentment and went on lying there looking round her, taking in everything in her room, in her own little room, her very own, to arrange just as she pleased for this one blessed month. Her room, bought with her own savings, the fruit of her careful denials, whose door she could bolt if she wanted to, and nobody had the right to come in. It was such a strange little room, so different from any she had known, and so sweet. It was like a cell. Except for the 2 beds, it suggested a happy austerity. And the name of the chamber, she thought, quoting and smiling round at it, was peace. Well, this was delicious, to lie there thinking how happy she was, but outside those shutters it was more delicious still. She jumped up, pulled on her slippers, for there was nothing on the stone floor but one small rug, ran to the window, and threw open the shutters. "Oh!" cried Mrs. Wilkins. All the radiance of April in Italy lay gathered together at her feet. The sun poured in on her. The sea lay asleep in it, hardly stirring. Across the bay, the lovely mountains, exquisitely different in colour, were asleep too in the light. And underneath her window, at the bottom of the flower-starred grass slope from which the wall of the castle rose up, was a great cypress, cutting through the delicate blues and violets and rose colours of the mountains and the sea like a great black sword. She stared. Such beauty, and she there to see it. Such beauty, and she alive to feel it. Her face was bathed in light. Lovely scents came up to the window and caressed her. A tiny breeze gently lifted her hair. Far out in the bay, a cluster of almost motionless fishing boats hovered like a flock of white birds on the tranquil sea. How beautiful, how beautiful. Not to have died before this. To have been allowed to see, breathe, feel this. She stared, her lips parted. Happy? Poor, ordinary, everyday word. But what could one say? How could one describe it? It was as though she could hardly stay inside herself. It was as though she were too small to hold so much of joy. It was as though she were washed through with light. And how astonishing to feel this sheer bliss, for here she was, not doing and not going to do a single unselfish thing, not going to do a thing she didn't want to. According to everybody she had ever come across, she ought to at least have twinges. She had not one twinge. Something was wrong somewhere. Wonderful that at home she should have been so good, so terribly good, and merely felt tormented. Twinges of every sort had there been her portion. Aches, hurts, discouragements, and she the whole time being steadily unselfish. Now she had taken off all her goodness and left it behind her, like a heap in rain-sodden clothes, and she only felt joy. She was naked of goodness, and was rejoicing in being naked. She was stripped and exulting. And there, away in the dim mugginess of Hampstead, was Mellersh, being angry. She tried to visualize Mellersh. She tried to see him having breakfast and thinking bitter things about her. And lo, Mellersh himself began to shimmer, became rose-colour, became delicate violet, became an enchanting blue, became formless, became iridescent. Actually, Mellersh, after quivering a minute, was lost in light. Well, thought Mrs. Wilkins, staring, as it were, after him. How extraordinary not to be able to visualize Mellersh, and she who used to know every feature, every expression of his by heart. She simply could not see him as he was. She could only see him resolved into beauty, melted into harmony with everything else. The familiar words of the general thanksgiving came quite naturally into her mind, and she found herself blessing God for her creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life, but above all for his inestimable love, out loud in a burst of acknowledgement. While Mellersh, at that moment angrily pulling on his boots before going out into the dripping streets, was indeed thinking bitter things about her. She began to dress, choosing clean white clothes in honour of the summer's day, unpacking her suitcases, tidying her adorable little room. She moved about with quick, purposeful steps, her long, thin body held up straight, her small face, so much puckered at home with effort and fear, smoothed out. All she had been and done before this morning, all she had felt and worried about, was gone. Each of her worries behaved as the image of Mellersh had behaved, and dissolved into colour and light. And she noticed things she had not noticed for years. When she was doing her hair in front of the glass, she noticed it and thought, why, what pretty stuff. For years she had forgotten she had such a thing as hair, plaiting it in the evening and unplaiting it in the morning with the same hurry and indifference with which she laced and unlaced her shoes. Now she suddenly saw it, and she twisted it round her fingers before the glass and was glad it was so pretty. Mellersh couldn't have seen it either, for he had never said a word about it. Well, when she got home, she would draw his attention to it. Mellersh, she would say, look at my hair. Aren't you pleased you've got a wife with hair like curly honey? She laughed. She'd never said anything like that to Mellersh yet, and the idea of it amused her. But why had she not? Oh, yes, she used to be afraid of him. Funny to be afraid of anybody, and especially of one's husband, whom one saw in his more simplified moments, such as sleep and not breathing properly through his nose. When she was ready, she opened her door to go across to see if Rose, who had been put the night before by a sleepy maidservant into a cell opposite, were awake. She would say good morning to her, and then she would run down and stay with that cypress tree till breakfast was ready. And after breakfast she wouldn't so much as look out of a window till she had helped Rose get everything ready for Lady Caroline and Mrs. Fisher. There was much to be done that day, settling in, arranging the rooms. She mustn't leave Rose to do it alone. They would make it all so lovely for the two to come, have such an entrancing vision ready for them of little cells bright with flowers. She remembered She had wanted Lady Caroline not to come. Fancy wanting to shut someone out of heaven because she thought she would be shy of her. And as though it mattered if she were. And as though she would be anything so self-conscious as shy. Besides, what a reason. She could not accuse herself of goodness over that. And she remembered she wanted not to have Mrs. Fisher either, because she had seemed lofty. How funny of her. So funny to worry about such little things, making them important. The bedrooms and 2 of the sitting rooms at San Salvatore were on the top floor and opened into a roomy hall with a wide glass window at the north end. San Salvatore was rich in small gardens in different parts and on different levels. The garden this window looked down on was made on the highest part of the walls and could only be reached through the corresponding spacious hall on the floor below. When Mrs. Wilkins came out of her room, this window stood wide open, and beyond it in the sun was a Judas tree in full flower. There was no sign of anybody, no sound of voices or feet. Tubs of arum lilies stood about on the stone floor, and on the table flamed a huge bunch of fierce nasturtiums. Spacious, flowery, silent, with the wide window at the end opening into the garden, and the Judas tree, absurdly beautiful in the sunshine, it seemed to Mrs. Wilkins, arrested on her way across to Mrs. Arbuthnot, too good to be true. Was she really going to live in this for a whole month? Up to now she had had to take what beauty she could as she went along, snatching at little bits of it when she came across it. A patch of daisies on a fine day in a Hampstead field, a flash of sunset between 2 chimney pots. She had never been in definitely, completely beautiful places. She had never been even in a venerable house, and such a thing as a profusion of flowers in her rooms was unattainable to her. Sometimes in the spring she had bought 6 tulips at Shoolbred's, unable to resist them, conscious that Mellersh, if he knew what they had cost, would think it inexcusable. But they had soon died, and then there were no more. As for the Judas tree, she hadn't an idea what it was, and gazed at it out there against the sky with the rapt expression of one who sees a heavenly vision. Mrs. Arbuthnot, coming out of her room, found her there like that, standing in the middle of the hall, staring. Now what does she think she sees now, thought Mrs. Arbuthnot. We are in God's hands, said Mrs. Wilkins, turning to her, speaking with extreme conviction. Oh, said Mrs. Arbuthnot quickly, her face, which had covered with smiles when she came out of her room, falling. Why? What has happened? For Mrs. Arbuthnot had woken up with such a delightful feeling of security, of relief, and she did not want to find she had not, after all, escaped from the need of a refuge. She had not even dreamed of Frederick. For the first time in years she had been spared the nightly dream that he was with her, that they were heart to heart, and its miserable wakening. She had slept like a baby, and had woken up confident. She had found there was nothing she wished to say in her morning prayer, except "Thank you." It was disconcerting to be told she was, after all, in God's hands. I hope nothing has happened, she asked anxiously. Mrs. Wilkins looked at her a moment and laughed. How funny, she said, kissing her. What is funny? Asked Mrs. Arbuthnot, her face clearing because Mrs. Wilkins laughed. We are. This is. Everything. It's all so wonderful. It's so funny and so adorable that we should be in it. I dare say when we finally reach heaven, the one they talk about so much, we shan't find it a bit more beautiful. Mrs. Arbuthnot relaxed to smiling security again. Isn't it divine? She said. Were you ever in your life so happy? Asked Mrs. Wilkins, catching her by the arm. No, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Nor had she been, not ever. Not even in her first love days with Frederick, because always pain had been close at hand in that other happiness, ready to torture with doubts, to torture even with the very excess of her love, while this was the simple happiness of complete harmony with her surroundings, the happiness that asks for nothing, that just accepts, just breathes, just is. Let's go and look at that tree close, said Mrs. Wilkins. I don't believe it can only be a tree. And arm in arm they went along the hall, and their husbands would not have known them, their faces were so young with eagerness, and together they stood at the open window. And when their eyes, having feasted on the marvellous pink thing, wandered farther along the beauties of the garden, they saw sitting on the low wall at the east edge of it, gazing out over the bay, her feet in lilies, Lady Caroline. They were astonished. They said nothing in their astonishment, but stood quite still, arm in arm, staring down at her. She too had on a white frock, and her head was bare. They had had no idea that day in London, when her hat was down to her nose and her furs were up to her ears, that she was so pretty. They had merely thought her different from the other women in the club. And so had the other women themselves. And so had all the waitresses, eyeing her sideways and eyeing her again as they passed the corner where she sat talking. But they had had no idea she was so pretty. She was exceedingly pretty. Everything about her was very much that which it was. Her fair hair was very fair. Her lovely grey eyes were very lovely and grey. Her dark eyelashes were very dark. Her white skin was very white. Her red mouth was very red. She was extravagantly slender, the merest thread of a girl, though not without little curves beneath her thin frock where little curves should be. She was looking out across the bay and was sharply defined against the background of empty blue. She was full in the sun. Her feet dangled among the leaves and flowers of the lilies, just as if it did not matter that they should be bent or bruised. She ought to have a headache, whispered Mrs. Arbuthnot at last, sitting there in the sun like that. She ought to have a hat, whispered Mrs. Wilkins. She's treading on lilies. But they're hers as much as ours. Only 1/4 of them. Lady Caroline turned her head. She looked up at them a moment, surprised to see them so much younger than they seemed that day at the club, and so much less unattractive. Indeed, they were really almost quite attractive, if one could ever be really quite attractive in the wrong clothes. Her eyes, swiftly glancing over them, took in every inch of them in the half-second before she smiled and waved her hand and called out, "Good morning." There was nothing, she saw at once, to be hoped for in the way of interest from their clothes. She did not consciously think this, for she was having a violent reaction against beautiful clothes and the slavery they impose on one, her experience being that the instant one had got them, they took one in hand and gave one no peace till they had been everywhere and been seen by everybody. You didn't take your clothes to parties, they took you. It was quite a mistake to think that a woman, a really well-dressed woman, wore out her clothes. It was the clothes that wore out the woman, dragging her about at all hours of the day and night. No wonder men stayed younger longer. Just new trousers couldn't excite them. She couldn't suppose that even the newest trousers ever behaved like that, taking the bit between their teeth. Her images were disorderly, but she thought as she chose. She used what images she liked. As she got off the wall and came towards the window, it seemed a restful thing to know she was going to spend an entire month with people in dresses made, as she dimly remembered, dresses used to be made 5 summers ago. "I got here yesterday morning," she said, looking up at them and smiling. She really was bewitching. She had everything, even a dimple. "It's a great pity," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling back, "because we were going to choose the nicest room for you." "Oh, but I've done that," said Lady Caroline. "At least, I think it's the nicest. It looks two ways. I adore a room that looks two ways, don't you? Over the sea to the west and over this Judas tree to the north." "And we'd meant to make it pretty for you, with flowers," said Mrs. Wilkins. "Oh, Domenico did that. I told him to directly I got here. He's the gardener. He's wonderful." "It's a good thing, of course," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, a little hesitatingly, "to be independent and to know exactly what one wants." "Yes, it saves trouble," agreed Lady Caroline. "But one shouldn't be so independent," said Mrs. Wilkins, "as to leave no opportunity for other people to exercise their benevolences on one." Lady Caroline, who had been looking at Mrs. Arbuthnot, now looked at Mrs. Wilkins. That day at the queer club she'd had merely a blurred impression of Mrs. Wilkins, for it was the other one who did all the talking, and her impression had been of somebody so shy, so awkward, that it was best to take no notice of her. She'd not even been able to say goodbye properly, doing it in an agony, turning red, turning damp. Therefore she now looked at her in some surprise, and she was still more surprised when Mrs. Wilkins added, gazing at her with the most obvious sincere admiration, speaking indeed with a conviction that refused to remain unuttered, "I didn't realize you were so pretty." She stared at Mrs. Wilkins. She was not usually told this quite so immediately and roundly, abundantly as she was used to it. Impossible not to be after 28 solid years. It surprised her to be told it with such bluntness, and by a woman. "It's very kind of you to think so," she said. "Why, you're very lovely," said Mrs. Wilkins. "Quite, quite lovely." "I hope," said Mrs. Arbuthnot pleasantly, "you make the most of it." Lady Caroline then stared at Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Oh, yes," she said. "I make the most of it. I've been doing that ever since I can remember." "Because," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling and raising a warning forefinger, "it won't last." Then Lady Caroline began to be afraid these two were originals. If so, she would be bored. Nothing bored her so much as people who insisted on being original, who came and buttonholed her and kept her waiting while they were being original. And the one who admired her, it would be tiresome if she dogged her about in order to look at her. What she wanted of this holiday was complete escape from all she had had before. She wanted the rest of complete contrast. Being admired, being dogged wasn't contrast, it was repetition. And as for originals, to find herself shut up with two on the top of a precipitous hill in a medieval castle built for the express purpose of preventing easy-goings in and out would not, she was afraid, be especially restful. Perhaps she had better be a little less encouraging. They had seemed such timid creatures, even the dark one, she couldn't remember their names, that day at the club, that she had felt it quite safe to be very friendly. Here they had come out of their shells, already. Indeed, at once. There was no sign of timidity about either of them here. If they had got out of their shells so immediately, at the very first contact, unless she checked them, they would soon begin to press upon her, and then goodbye to her dream of 30 restful silent days, lying unmolested in the sun, getting her feathers smooth again, not being spoken to, not waited on, not grabbed at and monopolized, but just recovering from the fatigue, the deep and melancholy fatigue of the too much. Besides, there was Mrs. Fisher. She too must be checked. Lady Caroline had started 2 days earlier than had been arranged for 2 reasons. First, because she wished to arrive before the others in order to pick out the room or rooms she preferred, and second, because she judged it likely that otherwise she would have to travel with Mrs. Fisher. She did not want to travel with Mrs. Fisher. She did not want to arrive with Mrs. Fisher. She saw no reason whatever why for a single moment she should have to have anything at all to do with Mrs. Fisher. But unfortunately Mrs. Fisher also was filled with a desire to get to San Salvatore first and pick out the room or rooms she preferred, and she and Lady Caroline had after all travelled together. As early as Calais they began to suspect it. In Paris they feared it. At Modana they knew it. At Mezzago they concealed it, driving out to Castagneto in 2 separate flies, the nose of the one almost touching the back of the other the whole way. But when the road suddenly left off at the church and the steps, further evasion was impossible, and faced by this abrupt and difficult finish to their journey, there was nothing for it but to amalgamate. Because of Mrs. Fisher's stick, Lady Caroline had to see about everything. Mrs. Fisher's intentions, she explained from her fly when the situation had become plain to her, were active, but her stick prevented their being carried out. The 2 drivers told Lady Caroline boys would have to carry the luggage up to the castle, and she went in search of some, while Mrs. Fisher waited in the fly because of her stick. Mrs. Fisher could speak Italian, but only, she explained, the Italian of Dante, which Matthew Arnold used to read with her when she was a girl, and she thought this might be above the heads of boys. Therefore Lady Caroline, who spoke ordinary Italian very well, was obviously the one to go and do things. "I am in your hands," said Mrs. Fisher, sitting firmly in her fly. "You must please regard me as merely an old woman with a stick." And presently, down the steps and cobbles to the piazza and along the quay, and up the zigzag path, Lady Caroline found herself as much obliged to walk slowly with Mrs. Fisher as if she were her own grandmother. "It's my stick," Mrs. Fisher complacently remarked at intervals. And when they rested at those bends of the zigzag path where seats were, and Lady Caroline, who would have liked to run on and get to the top quickly, was forced, in common humanity, to remain with Mrs. Fisher because of her stick, Mrs. Fisher told her how she had been on a zigzag path once with Tennyson. "Isn't his cricket wonderful?" said Lady Caroline absently. "The Tennyson," said Mrs. Fisher, turning her head and observing her a moment over her spectacles. "Isn't he?" said Lady Caroline. "And it was a path, too," Mrs. Fisher went on severely, "curiously like this. No eucalyptus tree, of course, but otherwise curiously like this. And at one of the bends he turned and said to me, I see him now, turning and saying to me—" Yes, Mrs. Fisher would have to be checked, and so would these 2 up at the window. She'd better begin at once. She was sorry she had got off the wall. All she need have done was to have waved her hand and waited till they came down and out into the garden to her. So she ignored Mrs. Arbuthnot's remark and raised forefinger, and said with marked coldness, at least she tried to make it sound marked, that she supposed they would be going to breakfast, and that she'd had hers. But it was her fate that however coldly she sent forth her words, they came out sounding quite warm and agreeable. That was because she had a sympathetic and delightful voice, due entirely to some special formation of her throat and the roof of her mouth, and having nothing whatever to do with what she was feeling. Nobody, in consequence, ever believed they were being snubbed. It was most tiresome. And if she stared icily, it did not look icy at all, because her eyes, lovely to begin with, had the added loveliness of very long, soft, dark eyelashes. No icy stare could come out of eyes like that. It got caught and lost in the soft eyelashes, and the person stared at merely thought they were being regarded with a flattering and exquisite attentiveness. And if ever she was out of humour or definitely cross, and who would not be sometimes in such a world, she only looked so pathetic that people all rushed to comfort her, if possible by means of kissing. It was more than tiresome. It was maddening. Nature was determined that she should look and sound angelic. She could never be disagreeable or rude without being completely misunderstood. "I had breakfast in my room," she said, trying her utmost to sound curt. "Perhaps I'll see you later." And she nodded and went back to where she'd been sitting on the wall, with the lilies being nice and cool around her feet. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Their eyes followed her admiringly. They had no idea they had been snubbed. It was a disappointment, of course, to find she had forestalled them, and that they were not to have the happiness of preparing for her, of watching her face when she arrived and first saw everything. But there was still Mrs. Fisher. They would concentrate on Mrs. Fisher and would watch her face instead. Only, like everybody else, they would have preferred to watch Lady Caroline's. Perhaps then, as Lady Caroline had talked of breakfast, they had better begin by going and having it, for there was too much to be done that day to spend any more time gazing at the scenery, servants to be interviewed, the house to be gone through and examined, and finally Mrs. Fisher's room to be got ready and adorned. They waved their hands gaily at Lady Caroline, who seemed absorbed in what she saw and took no notice, and turning away found the maidservant of the night before had come up silently behind them in cloth slippers with string soles. She was Francesca, the elderly parlour-maid, who had been with the owner, he had said, for years, and whose presence made inventories unnecessary. And after wishing them good morning and hoping they had slept well, she told them breakfast was ready in the dining-room on the floor below, and if they would follow her, she would lead. They did not understand a single word of the very many in which Francesca succeeded in clothing this simple information, but they followed her, for it was at least clear that they were to follow, and going down the stairs and along the broad hall, like the one above except for glass doors at the end instead of a window opening into the garden, they were shown into the dining-room, where, sitting at the head of the table, having her breakfast, was Mrs. Fisher. This time they exclaimed. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot exclaimed, though her exclamation was only, "Oh!" Mrs. Wilkins exclaimed at greater length. "Oh, I bet it's like having the bread taken out of one's mouth," exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins. "How do you do?" said Mrs. Fisher. "I can't get up because of my stick." And she stretched out her hand across the table. They advanced and shook it. "We had no idea you were here," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Yes," said Mrs. Fisher, resuming her breakfast. "Yes, I am here." And with composure she removed the top of her egg. "It's a great disappointment," said Mrs. Wilkins. "We had meant to give you such a welcome." This was the one, Mrs. Fisher remembered, briefly glancing at her, who, when she came to Prince of Wales Terrace, said she had seen Keats. She must be careful with this one, curb her from the beginning. She therefore ignored Mrs. Wilkins and said gravely, with a downward face of impenetrable calm bent on her egg, "Yes, I arrived yesterday with Lady Caroline." "It's really dreadful," said Mrs. Wilkins, exactly as if she had not been ignored. "There's nobody left to get anything ready for now. I feel thwarted. I feel as if the bread had been taken out of my mouth just when I was going to be happy swallowing it." "Where will you sit?" asked Mrs. Fisher of Mrs. Arbuthnot. Markedly of Mrs. Arbuthnot. The comparison with the bread seemed to her most unpleasant. "Oh, thank you," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, sitting down rather suddenly next to her. There were only two places she could sit down in, the places laid on either side of Mrs. Fisher. She therefore sat down in one, and Mrs. Wilkins sat down opposite her in the other. Mrs. Fisher was at the head of the table. Round her was grouped the coffee and the tea. Of course they were all sharing San Salvatore equally, but it was she herself and Lotty, Mrs. Arbuthnot mildly reflected, who had found it, who had had the work of getting it, who had chosen to admit Mrs. Fisher into it. Without them, she could not help thinking, Mrs. Fisher would not have been there. Morally, Mrs. Fisher was a guest. There was no hostess in this party, but, supposing there had been a hostess, it would not have been Mrs. Fisher, nor Lady Caroline. It would have been either herself or Lotty. Mrs. Arbuthnot could not help feeling this as she sat down, and Mrs. Fisher, the hand which Ruskin had wrung suspended over the pots before her, inquired, "Tea or coffee?" She could not help feeling it even more definitely when Mrs. Fisher touched a small gong on the table beside her, as though she had been used to that gong and that table ever since she was little, and on Francesca's appearing bade her in the language of Dante bring more milk. There was a curious air about Mrs. Fisher, thought Mrs. Arbuthnot, of being in possession, and if she herself had not been so happy, she would have perhaps minded. Mrs. Wilkins noticed it too, but it only made her discursive brain think of cuckoos. She would no doubt immediately have begun to talk of cuckoos, incoherently, unrestrainably, and deplorably, if she had been in the condition of nerves and shyness she was in last time she saw Mrs. Fisher. But happiness had done away with shyness. She was very serene. She could control her conversation. She did not have, horrified, to listen to herself saying things she had no idea of saying when she began. She was quite at her ease and completely natural. The disappointment of not going to be able to prepare a welcome for Mrs. Fisher had evaporated at once, for it was impossible to go on being disappointed in heaven. Nor did she mind her behaving as hostess. What did it matter? You did not mind things in heaven. She and Mrs. Arbuthnot, therefore, sat down more willingly than they otherwise would have done, one on either side of Mrs. Fisher, and the sun, pouring through the two windows facing east across the bay, flooded the room, and there was an open door leading into the garden, and the garden was full of many lovely things, especially freesias. The delicate and delicious fragrance of the freesias came in through the door and floated round Mrs. Wilkins' enraptured nostrils. Freesias in London were quite beyond her. Occasionally she went into a shop and asked what they cost, so as just to have an excuse for lifting up a bunch and smelling them, well knowing that it was something awful, like $1 for about 3 flowers. Here they were everywhere, bursting out of every corner and carpeting the rose beds. Imagine it, having freesias to pick in armsful if you wanted to, and with glorious sunshine flooding the room, and in your summer frock, and its being only the 1st of April. I suppose you realize, don't you, that we've got to heaven? She said, beaming at Mrs. Fisher with all the familiarity of a fellow angel. They are considerably younger than I had supposed, thought Mrs. Fisher, and not nearly so plain. And she mused a moment while she took no notice of Mrs. Wilkins's exuberance on their instant and agitated refusal that day at Prince of Wales Terrace to have anything to do with the giving or the taking of references. Nothing could affect her, of course, nothing that anybody did. She was far too solidly seated in respectability. At her back stood massively in a tremendous row those 3 great names she had offered, and they were not the only ones she could turn to for support and countenance. Even if these young women— she had no grounds for believing the one out in the garden to be really Lady Caroline Dester, she'd merely been told she was— even if these young women should all turn out to be what Browning used to call— how well she remembered his amazing and delightful way of putting things— fly-by-nights, what could it possibly, or in any way, matter to her? Let them fly by night if they wished. One was not 65 for nothing. In any case, there would only be 4 weeks of it, at the end of which she would see no more of them. And in the meantime there were plenty of places where she could sit quietly away from them and remember. Also, there was her own sitting-room, a charming room, all honey-coloured furniture and pictures, with windows to the sea towards Genoa, and a door opening to the battlements. The house possessed 2 sitting-rooms, and she explained to that pretty creature, Lady Caroline— certainly a pretty creature, whatever else she was. Tennyson would have enjoyed taking her for blows on the downs— who had seemed inclined to appropriate the honey-coloured one, that she needed some little refuge entirely to herself because of her stick. "Nobody wants to see an old woman hobbling about everywhere," she had said. "I shall be quite content to spend much of my time by myself in here, or sitting out on these convenient battlements." And she had a very nice bedroom, too. It looked 2 ways, across the bay in the morning sun— she liked the morning sun— and onto the garden. There were only 2 of these bedrooms with cross views in the house, she and Lady Caroline had discovered, and they were by far the airiest. They each had 2 beds in them, and she and Lady Caroline had had the extra beds taken out at once and put into 2 of the other rooms. In this way there was much more space and comfort. Lady Caroline, indeed, had turned hers into a bed-sitting-room, with the sofa out of the bigger drawing-room, and the writing-table and the most comfortable chair. But she herself had not had to do that, because she had her own sitting-room, equipped with what was necessary. Lady Caroline had thought at first of taking the bigger sitting-room entirely for her own, because the dining-room on the floor below could quite well be used between meals to sit in by the 2 others. It was a very pleasant room with nice chairs, but she had not liked the bigger sitting-room's shape. It was a round room in the tower with deep slit windows pierced through the massive walls, and a domed and ribbed ceiling arranged to look like an open umbrella, and it seemed a little dark. Undoubtedly Lady Caroline had cast covetous glances at the honey-coloured room, and if she, Mrs. Fisher, had been less firm, would have installed herself in it, which would have been absurd. "I hope," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smilingly making an attempt to convey to Mrs. Fisher that though she, Mrs. Fisher, might not be exactly a guest, she certainly was not in the very least a hostess. "Your room is comfortable." "Quite," said Mrs. Fisher. "Will you have some more coffee?" "No, thank you." Will you? No, thank you. There were 2 beds in my bedroom, filling it up unnecessarily, and I had one taken out. It has made it much more convenient. Oh, that's why I've got 2 beds in my room, exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins, illuminated. The second bed in her little cell had seemed an unnatural and inappropriate object from the moment she saw it. I gave no directions, said Mrs. Fisher, addressing Mrs. Arbuthnot. I merely asked Francesca to remove it. I have 2 in my room as well, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Your second one must be Lady Caroline's. She had hers removed too, said Mrs. Fisher. It seems foolish to have more beds in a room than there are occupiers. But we haven't got husbands here either, said Mrs. Wilkins, and I don't see any use in extra beds in one's room if one hasn't got husbands to put in them. Can't we have them taken away too? Beds, said Mrs. Fisher coldly, cannot be removed from one room after another. They must remain somewhere. Mrs. Wilkins's remarks seemed to Mrs. Fisher persistently unfortunate. Each time she opened her mouth, she said something best left unsaid. Loose talk about husbands had never in Mrs. Fisher's circle been encouraged. In the 80s, when she chiefly flourished, husbands were taken seriously, as the only real obstacles to sin. Beds, too, if they had to be mentioned, were approached with caution, and a decent reserve prevented them and husbands ever being spoken of in the same breath. She turned more markedly than ever to Mrs. Arbuthnot. Do let me give you a little more coffee, she said. No, thank you. But won't you have some more? No, indeed. I never have more than 2 cups at breakfast. Would you like an orange? No, thank you. Would you? No, I don't eat fruit at breakfast. It is an American fashion which I am too old now to adopt. Have you had all you want? Quite. Have you? Mrs. Fisher paused before replying. Was this a habit, this trick of answering a simple question with the same question? If so, it must be curbed, for no one could live for 4 weeks in any real comfort with somebody who had a habit. She glanced at Mrs. Arbuthnot, and her parted hair and gentle brow reassured her. No, it was accident, not habit, that had produced those echoes. She could as soon imagine a dove having tiresome habits as Mrs. Arbuthnot. Considering her, she thought what a splendid wife she would have been for poor Carlyle. So much better than that horrid clever Jane. She would have soothed him. Then shall we go? She suggested. Let me help you up, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, all consideration. Oh, thank you. I can manage perfectly. It's only sometimes that my stick prevents me. Mrs. Fisher got up quite easily. Mrs. Arbuthnot had hovered over her for nothing. I'm going to have one of these gorgeous oranges, said Mrs. Wilkins, staying where she was and reaching across to a black bowl piled with them. Rose, how can you resist them? Look, have this one. Do have this beauty. And she held out a big one. No, I'm going to see to my duties, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, moving towards the door. You'll forgive me for leaving you, won't you? She added politely to Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher moved towards the door too, quite easily, almost quickly. Her stick did not hinder her at all. She had no intention of being left with Mrs. Wilkins. What time would you like to have lunch? Mrs. Arbuthnot asked her, trying to keep her head as at least a non-guest, if not precisely a hostess, above water. Lunch, said Mrs. Fisher, is at 12:30. You shall have it at 12:30 then, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. I'll tell the cook. It will be a great struggle," she continued, smiling, "but I've brought a little dictionary." "The cook," said Mrs. Fisher, "knows." "Oh," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Lady Caroline has already told her," said Mrs. Fisher. "Oh," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "Yes, Lady Caroline speaks the kind of Italian cooks understand. I am prevented going into the kitchen because of my stick. And even if I were able to go, I fear I shouldn't be understood." "But—" began Mrs. Arbuthnot. "But it's too wonderful," Mrs. Wilkins finished for her from the table, delighted with these unexpected simplifications in her and Rose's lives. "Why, we've got positively nothing to do here, either of us, except just be happy. You wouldn't believe," she said, turning her head and speaking straight to Mrs. Fisher, portions of orange in either hand, "how terribly good Rose and I have been 4 years without stopping, and how much now we need a perfect rest." And Mrs. Fisher, going without answering her out the room, said to herself, she shall be curbed. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8. Presently, when Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot, unhampered by any duties, wandered out and down the worn stone steps and under the pergola into the lower garden, Mrs. Wilkins said to Mrs. Arbuthnot, who seemed pensive, "Don't you see that if somebody else does the ordering, it frees us?" Mrs. Arbuthnot said she did see, but nevertheless she thought it rather silly to have everything taken out of their hands. "I love things to be taken out of my hands," said Mrs. Wilkins. "But we found San Salvatore," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, "and it is rather silly that Mrs. Fisher should behave as if it belonged only to her." "What is rather silly," said Mrs. Wilkins with much serenity, "is to mind. I can't see the least point in being in authority at the price of one's liberty." Mrs. Arbuthnot said nothing to that for 2 reasons. First, because she was struck by the remarkable and growing calm of the hitherto incoherent and excited Lotty, and secondly, because what she was looking at was so very beautiful. All down the stone steps on either side were periwinkles in full flower, and she could now see what it was that had caught at her the night before and brushed, wet and scented, across her face. It was wisteria. Wisteria and sunshine. She remembered the advertisement. Here indeed were both in profusion. The wisteria was tumbling over itself in its excess of life, its prodigality of flowering, and where the pergola ended the sun blazed on scarlet geraniums, bushes of them, and nasturtiums in great heaps, and marigolds so brilliant that they seemed to be burning, and red and pink snapdragons all outdoing each other in bright, fierce colour. The ground behind these flaming things dropped away in terraces to the sea, each terrace a little orchard, where among the olives grew vines on trellises, and fig trees, and peach trees, and cherry trees. The cherry trees and peach trees were in blossom, lovely showers of white and deep rose colour among the trembling delicacy of the olives. The fig leaves were just big enough to smell of figs. The vine buds were only beginning to show. And beneath these trees were groups of blue and purple irises, and bushes of lavender and grey, sharp cactuses. And the grass was thick with dandelions and daisies, and right down at the bottom was the sea. Colour seemed flung down anyhow, anywhere, every sort of colour piled up in heaps, pouring along in rivers, The periwinkles looked exactly as if they'd been poured down each side of the steps, and flowers that grow only in borders in England, proud flowers keeping themselves to themselves over there, such as the great blue irises and the lavender, were being jostled by small, shining common things like dandelions and daisies, and the white bells of the wild onion, and only seemed the better and the more exuberant for it. They stood looking at this crowd of loveliness, this happy jumble, in silence. No, it didn't matter what Mrs. Fisher did. Not here, not in such beauty. Mrs. Arbuthnot's discomposure melted out of her. In the warmth and light of what she was looking at, of what to her was a manifestation and entirely new side of God, how could one be discomposed? If only Frederick were with her seeing it too, seeing as he would have seen it when first they were lovers, in the days when he saw what she saw and loved what she loved. She sighed. "You mustn't sigh in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins. "One doesn't." "I was thinking how one longs to share this with those one loves," said Mrs. Arbuthnot. "You mustn't long in heaven," said Mrs. Wilkins. "You're supposed to be quite complete there." "And it is heaven, isn't it, Rose? See how everything has been let in together, the dandelions and the irises, the vulgar and the superior, me and Mrs. Fisher, all welcome, all mixed up anyhow, and all so visibly happy and enjoying ourselves." "Mrs. Fisher doesn't seem happy, not visibly anyhow," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, smiling. "She'll begin soon. You'll see." Mrs. Arbuthnot said she didn't believe that after a certain age people began anything. Mrs. Wilkins said she was sure no one, however old and tough, could resist the effects of perfect beauty. Before many days, perhaps only hours, they would see Mrs. Fisher bursting out into every kind of exuberance. "I'm quite sure," said Mrs. Wilkins, "that we've got to heaven, and once Mrs. Fisher realizes that that's where she is, she's bound to be different. You'll see. She'll leave off being ossified and go all soft and able to stretch, and we shall be why, I shouldn't be surprised if we get quite fond of her." The idea of Mrs. Fisher bursting out into anything, she who seemed so particularly firmly fixed inside her buttons, made Mrs. Arbuthnot laugh. She condoned Lotty's loose way of talking of heaven, because in such a place, on such a morning, condonation was in the very air. Besides, what an excuse there was. And Lady Caroline, sitting where they had left her before breakfast on the wall, peeped over when she heard laughter, and saw them standing on the path below, and thought what a mercy it was they were laughing down there and had not come up and done it round her. She disliked jokes at all times, but in the morning she hated them, especially close up, especially crowding in her ears. She hoped the originals were on their way out for a walk and not their way back from one. They were laughing more and more. What could they possibly find to laugh at? She looked down at the tops of their heads with a very serious face, for the thought of spending a month with laughers was a grave one, and they, as though they felt her eyes, turned suddenly and looked up. The dreadful geniality of those women. She shrank away from their smiles and wavings, but she could not shrink out of sight without falling into the lilies. She neither smiled nor waved back, and turning her eyes to the more distant mountains, surveyed them carefully, till the two, tired of waving, moved away along the path and turned the corner and disappeared. This time they both did notice that they had been met with at least unresponsiveness. If we weren't in heaven, said Mrs. Wilkins serenely, I should say we had been snubbed. But as nobody snubs anybody there, of course we can't have been. Perhaps she's unhappy, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Whatever it is, she'll get over it here, said Mrs. Wilkins with conviction. We must try and help her, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. Oh, but nobody helps anybody in heaven. That's finished with. You don't try to be or do. You simply are. Well, Mrs. Arbuthnot wouldn't go into that, not here, not today. The vicar, she knew, would have called Lottie's talk levity, if not profanity. How old he seemed from here, an old, old vicar. They left the path and clambered down the olive terraces, down and down, to where at the bottom the warm, sleepy sea heaved gently among the rocks. There a pine tree grew close to the water, and they sat under it, and a few yards away was a fishing boat lying motionless and green-bellied on the water. The ripples of the sea made little gurgling noises at their feet. They screwed up their eyes to be able to look into the blaze of light beyond the shade of their tree. The hot smell from the pine needles and from the cushions of wild thyme that padded the spaces between the rocks, and sometimes a smell of pure honey from a clump of warm irises up behind them in the sun, puffed across their faces. Very soon Mrs. Wilkins took her shoes and stockings off and let her feet hang in the water. After watching her a minute, Mrs. Arbuthnot did the same. Their happiness was then complete. Their husbands would not have known them. They left off talking. They ceased to mention heaven. They were just cups of acceptance. Meanwhile, Lady Caroline, on her wall, was considering her position. The garden on the top of the wall was a delicious garden, but its situation made it insecure and exposed to interruptions. At any moment the others might come and want to use it, because both the hall and the dining room had doors opening straight into it. Perhaps, thought Lady Caroline, she could arrange that it should be solely hers. Mrs. Fisher had the battlements, delightful with flowers, and a watchtower all to herself, besides having snatched the one really nice room in the house. There were plenty of places the originals could go to. She had herself seen at least 2 other little gardens, while the hill the castle stood on was itself a garden with walks and seats. Why should not this one spot be kept exclusively for her? She liked it. She liked it best of all. It had the Judas tree and an umbrella pine. It had the freesias and the lilies. It had a tamarisk beginning to flush pink. It had the convenient low wall to sit on. It had from each of its 3 sides the most amazing views. To the east the bay and mountains, to the north the village across the tranquil, clear green water of the little harbour, and the hills dotted with white houses and orange groves. And to the west was the thin thread of land by which San Salvatore was tied to the mainland, and then the open sea, and the coastline beyond Genoa reaching away into the blue dimness of France. Yes, she would say she wanted to have this entirely to herself. How obviously sensible if each of them had their own special place to sit in apart. It was essential to her comfort that she should be able to be apart, left alone, not talked to. The others ought to like it best too. Why herd? One had enough of that in England with one's relations and friends. Oh, the numbers of them, pressing on one continually. Having successfully escaped them for 4 weeks, why continue, and with persons having no earthly claim on one, to herd? She lit a cigarette. She began to feel secure. Those 2 had gone for a walk. There was no sign of Mrs. Fisher. How very pleasant this was. Somebody came out through the glass doors just as she was drawing a deep breath of security. Surely it couldn't be Mrs. Fisher wanting to sit with her. Mrs. Fisher had her battlements. She ought to stay on them, having snatched them. It would be too tiresome if she wouldn't, and wanted not only to have them in her sitting room, but to establish herself in this garden as well. No, it wasn't Mrs. Fisher, it was the cook. She frowned. Was she going to have to go on ordering the food? Surely one or other of those two waving women would do that now. The cook, who had been waiting in increasing agitation in the kitchen, watching the clock getting nearer to lunch, time while she still was without knowledge of what lunch was to consist of, had gone at last to Mrs. Fisher, who had immediately waved her away. She then wandered about the house seeking a mistress, any mistress, who would tell her what to cook, and finding none, and at last, directed by Francesca, who always knew where everybody was, came out to Lady Caroline. Domenica had provided this cook. She was Costanza, the sister of that one of his cousins who kept a restaurant down at the piazza. She helped her brother in his cooking when she had no other job, and knew every sort of fat, mysterious Italian dish, such as the workmen of Castagneto who crowded the restaurant at midday, and the inhabitants of Mezzago, when they came over on Sundays, loved to eat. She was a fleshless spinster of 50, grey-haired, nimble, rich of speech, and thought Lady Caroline more beautiful than anyone she had ever seen. And so did Domenico, and so did the boy Giuseppe, who helped Domenico and was, besides, his nephew. And so did the girl Angela, who helped Francesca and was, besides, Domenico's niece. And so did Francesca herself. Domenico and Francesca, the only two who had seen them, thought the two ladies who arrived last night very beautiful. But compared to the fair young lady who arrived first, they were as candles to the electric light that had lately been installed, and as the tin tubs in the bedrooms to the wonderful new bathroom their master had had arranged on his last visit. Lady Caroline scowled at the cook. The scowl, as usual, was transformed on the way into what appeared to be an intent and beautiful gravity, and Costanza threw up her hands and took the saints aloud to witness that here was the very picture of the Mother of God. Lady Caroline asked her crossly what she wanted, and Costanza's head went on one side with delight at the sheer music of her voice. She said, after waiting a moment in case the music was going to continue, for she didn't wish to miss any of it, that she wanted orders. She had been to the Signorina's mother, but in vain. "She is not my mother," repudiated Lady Caroline angrily, and her anger sounded like the regretful wail of a melodious orphan. Costanza poured forth pity. She too, she explained, had no mother. Lady Caroline interrupted with the curt information that her mother was alive and in London. Costanza praised God and the saints that the young lady did not yet know what it was like to be without a mother. Quickly enough did misfortunes overtake one. No doubt the young lady already had a husband. "No," said Lady Caroline icily. Worse than jokes in the morning did she hate the idea of husbands. And everybody was always trying to press them on her, all her relations, all her friends, all the evening papers. After all, she could only marry one anyhow, but she would think from the way everybody talked, and especially those persons who wanted to be husbands, that she could marry at least a dozen. Her soft, pathetic "no" made Costanza, who was standing close to her, well with sympathy. "Poor little one," said Costanza, moved actually to pat her encouragingly on the shoulder. "Take hope. There is still time." "For lunch," said Lady Caroline freezingly, marvelling as she spoke that she should be patted, she who had taken so much trouble to come to a place remote and hidden, where she could be sure that among other things of a like oppressive nature, pattings also were not. We will have— Costanza became businesslike. She interrupted with suggestions, and her suggestions were all admirable and all expensive. Lady Caroline did not know they were expensive and fell in with them at once. They sounded very nice. Every sort of young vegetables and fruits came into them, and much butter, and a great deal of cream, and incredible numbers of eggs. Costanza said enthusiastically at the end, as a tribute to this acquiescence, that of the many ladies and gentlemen she had worked for on temporary jobs such as this, she preferred the English ladies and gentlemen. She more than preferred them. They roused devotion in her, for they knew what to order. They did not skimp. They refrained from grinding down the faces of the poor. From this, Lady Caroline concluded that she had been extravagant, and promptly countermanded the cream. Costanza's face fell, for she had a cousin who had a cow, and the cream was to have come from them both. "And perhaps we had better not have chickens," said Lady Caroline. Costanza's face fell more, for her brother at the restaurant kept chickens in his backyard, and many of them were ready for killing. "Also, do not order strawberries till I have consulted with the other ladies," said Lady Caroline, remembering that it was only the 1st of April, and that perhaps people who lived in Hampstead might be poor, indeed must be poor, or else why live in Hampstead? "It is not I who am mistress here." "Is it the old one?" asked Costanza, her face very long. "No," said Lady Caroline. "Which of the other two ladies is it?" "Neither," said Lady Caroline. Then Costanza's smiles returned, for the young lady was having fun with her and making jokes. She told her so in her friendly Italian way, and was genuinely delighted. "I never make jokes," said Lady Caroline briefly. "You'd better go, or lunch will certainly not be ready by 12:30. And these curt words came out sounding so sweet that Costanza felt as if kind compliments were being paid her, and forgot her disappointment about the cream and the chickens, and went away all gratitude and smiles. "This," thought Lady Caroline, "will never do. I haven't come here to housekeep, and I won't." She called Costanza back. Costanza came running. The sound of her name in that voice enchanted her. "I've ordered the lunch for today," said Lady Caroline, with the serious angel face that was hers when she was annoyed, "and I've also ordered the dinner, but from now on you will go to one of the other ladies for orders. I give no more." The idea that she would go on giving orders was too absurd. She never gave orders at home. Nobody there dreamed of asking her to do anything. That such a very tiresome activity should be thrust upon her here, simply because she happened to be able to talk Italian, was ridiculous. Let the originals give orders if Mrs. Fisher refused to. Mrs. Fisher, of course, was the one nature intended for such a purpose. She had the very air of a competent housekeeper. Her clothes were the clothes of a housekeeper, and so was the way she did her hair. Having delivered herself of her ultimatum with an acerbity that turned sweet on the way, and accompanied it by a peremptory gesture of dismissal that had the grace and loving kindness of a benediction, it was annoying that Costanza should only stand still with her head on one side, gazing at her in obvious delight. "Oh, go away!" exclaimed Lady Caroline in English, suddenly exasperated. There had been a fly in her bedroom that morning which had stuck just as Costanza was sticking. Only one, but it might have been a myriad, it was so tiresome from daylight on. It was determined to settle on her face, and she was determined it should not. Its persistence was uncanny. It woke her, and would not let her go to sleep again. She hit at it, and it eluded her without fuss or effort, and with an almost visible blandness, and she had only hit herself. It came back again instantly, and with a loud buzz alighted on her cheek. She hit at it again and hurt herself, while it skimmed gracefully away. She lost her temper and sat up in bed and waited, watching to hit at it and kill it. She kept on hitting at it, at last with fury and with all her strength, as if it were a real enemy deliberately trying to madden her. And it elegantly skimmed in and out of her blows, not even angry, to be back again the next instant. It succeeded every time in getting onto her face, and was quite indifferent how often it was driven away. That was why she had dressed and come out so early. Francesca had already been told to put a net over her bed, for she was not going to allow herself to be annoyed twice like that. People were exactly like flies. She wished there were nets for keeping them off, too. She hit at them with words and frowns, and like the fly, they slipped between her blows and were untouched. Worse than the fly, they seemed unaware that she had even tried to hit them. The fly at least did for a moment go away. With human beings, the only way to get rid of them was to go away herself. That was what, so tired, she had done this April. And having got here, having got close up to the details of life at San Salvatore, it appeared that here, too, she was not to be let alone. Viewed from London, there had seemed to be no details. San Salvatore from there seemed to be an empty, a delicious blank. Yet after only 24 hours of it, she was discovering that it was not a blank at all, and that she was having to ward off as actively as ever. Already she had been much stuck to. Mrs. Fisher had stuck nearly the whole of the day before, and this morning there had been no peace, not 10 minutes uninterruptedly alone. Costanza, of course, had finally to go because she had to cook. But hardly had she gone before Domenico came. He came to water and tie up. That was natural, since he was the gardener. But he watered and tied up all the things that were nearest to her. He hovered closer and closer. He watered to excess. He tied plants that were as straight and steady as arrows. Well, at least he was a man, and therefore not quite so annoying. And his smiling good morning was received with an answering smile, upon which Domenico forgot his family, his wife, his mother, his grown-up children, and all his duties, and only wanted to kiss the young lady's feet. He could not do that, unfortunately, but he could talk while he worked, and talk he did, voluminously, pouring out every kind of information, illustrating what he said with gestures so lively that he had to put down the watering pot and thus delay the end of the watering. Lady Caroline bore it for a time, but presently was unable to bear it, and as he would not go, and she could not tell him to, seeing that he was engaged in his proper work, once again it was she who had to. She got off the wall and moved to the other side of the garden, where in a wooden shed were some comfortable low cane chairs. All she wanted was to turn one of these round with its back to Domenico and its front to the sea, towards Genoa. Such a little thing to want. One would have thought she might have been allowed to do that unmolested. But he, who watched her every moment, when he saw her approaching the chairs, darted after her and seized one, and asked to be told where to put it. Would she never get away from being waited on, being made comfortable, being asked where she wanted things put, having to say thank you? She was short with Domenico, who instantly concluded the sun had given her a headache, and ran in and fetched her a sunshade and a cushion and a footstool, and was skilful, and was wonderful, and was one of nature's gentlemen. She shut her eyes in a heavy resignation. She could not be unkind to Domenico. She could not get up and walk indoors, as she would have done if he'd been one of the others. Domenico was intelligent and very competent. She had at once discovered that it was he who really ran the house, who really did everything. And his manners were definitely delightful, and he undoubtedly was a charming person. It was only that she did so much long to be let alone. If only she could be left quite quiet for this 1 month, she felt that she might perhaps make something of herself after all. She kept her eyes shut, because then he would think she wanted to sleep and would go away. Domenico's romantic Italian soul melted within him at the sight, for having her eyes shut was extraordinarily becoming to her. He stood entranced, quite still, and she thought he had stolen away, so she opened them again. No, there he was, staring at her. Even he. There was no getting away from being stared at. "I have a headache," she said, shutting them again. "It is the sun," said Domenico, "and sitting on the wall without a hat." "I wish to sleep." "Si, signorina," he said sympathetically, and went softly away. She opened her eyes with a sigh of relief. The gentle closing of the glass doors showed her that he had not only gone quite away, but had shut her out in the garden so that she should be undisturbed. Now, perhaps, she would be alone till lunchtime. It was very curious, and no one in the world could have been more surprised than she herself, but she wanted to think. She had never wanted to do that before. Everything else that it is possible to do without too much inconvenience she'd either wanted to do or had done at one period or another of her life. But not before had she wanted to think. She had come to San Salvatore with the single intention of lying comatose for 4 weeks in the sun, somewhere where her parents and friends were not, lapped in forgetfulness, stirring herself only to be fed. And she had not been there more than a few hours when this strange new desire took hold of her. There had been wonderful stars the evening before, and she'd gone out into the top garden after dinner, leaving Mrs. Fisher alone over her nuts and wine. And sitting on the wall at the place where the lilies crowded their ghost heads, she had looked out into the gulf of the night, and it had suddenly seemed as if her life had been a noise, all about nothing. She'd been intensely surprised. She knew stars and darkness did produce unusual emotions, because in others she had seen them being produced, but they had not before done it in herself. A noise, all about nothing. Could she be quite well? She had wondered. For a long while past she had been aware that her life was a noise, but it had seemed to be very much about something, a noise indeed about so much that she felt she must get out of earshot for a little or she would be completely and perhaps permanently deafened. But suppose it was only a noise about nothing? She'd not had a question like that in her mind before. It had made her feel lonely. She wanted to be alone, but not lonely. That was very different. That was something that ached and hurt dreadfully right inside one. It was what one dreaded most. It was what made one go to so many parties. And lately even the parties had seemed once or twice not to be a perfectly certain protection. Was it possible that loneliness had nothing to do with circumstances, but only with the way one met them? Perhaps, she had thought, she'd better go to bed. She couldn't be very well. She went to bed, and in the morning, after she had escaped the fly and had her breakfast and got out again into the garden, there was this same feeling again, and in broad daylight. Once more she'd had that really rather disgusting suspicion that her life till now had not only been loud but empty. Well, if that were so, and if her first 28 years, the best ones, had gone just in meaningless noise, she had better stop a moment and look round her. Pause, as they said in tiresome novels, and consider. She hadn't got many sets of 28 years. One more would see her growing very like Mrs. Fisher. 2 more. She averted her eyes. Her mother would have been concerned if she had known. Her mother doted. Her father would have been concerned too, for he also doted. Everybody doted. And then, melodiously obstinate, she had insisted on going off to entomb herself in Italy for a whole month, with queer people she had got out of an advertisement, refusing even to take her maid. The only explanation her friends could imagine was that poor Scrap, such was her name among them, had overdone it and was feeling a little nervy. Her mother had been distressed at her departure. It was such an odd thing to do, such a sign of disappointment. She encouraged the general idea of the verge of a nervous breakdown. If she could have seen her adored Scrap, more delightful to look at than any other mother's daughter had ever yet been, the object of her utmost pride, the source of all her fondest hopes, sitting staring at the empty noonday Mediterranean, considering her 3 possible sets of 28 years, she would have been miserable. To go away alone was bad. To think was worse. No good would come of the thinking of a beautiful young woman. Complications could come out of it in profusion, but no good. The thinking of the beautiful was bound to result in hesitations, in reluctances, in unhappiness all round. And here, if she could have seen her, sat her Scrap, thinking quite hard. And such things, such old things, things nobody ever began to think till they were at least 40. End of chapter 8.